Well, good afternoon. Thank you all for coming, and it's rather nice that we five should be meeting each other probably for the first time in some cases in about 35 years, and it's nice to reminisce about Radio North Sea International, which was quite an extraordinary station in more ways than one, which no doubt you'll hear in the next half an hour or so. So I think it might be a good idea, first of all, just to ask everyone how they first became involved in Radio North Sea. Chris Carey's sitting on my left. Chris is a bit of a legend in radio circles. In those days, he was Spangles Muldoon.
A legend in my own house.
A legend in his own house. So, Chris, how did you first become involved in RNI?
I think I heard Radioday on some high frequency near shortwave somewhere. I thought, this can't be for real. And then from there, I sort of tracked down a guy called Larry Tremaine,
who was the American program controller.
He thought he was.
Yeah.
And then from there, I went out with Peter Chicago, who they all thought was a disc jockey for about a week. So I don't think Peter ever made it to air, did he? He stayed as an engineer, was what he really was good at.
And Duncan Johnson, who's sitting on the end. Duncan was, not many people will know this, but Duncan actually gave Peter Murtha, who was our engineer, the nickname Chicago. I won't tell you how it came about.
Go on.
Yeah, go ahead. I call him Chicago Pete because he looked the most unlike any Chicago gangster I'd ever met in my life. And that's how it stuck.
So, Duncan, what are your early memories of RNI when you first went out there? How did it compare with the Galaxy, which was the Radio London ship that you were on?
It was meant... I better move the mic up. Even I can't shout that loud. Well, we started off... It looked... In the first instance, it was in good condition until I lay down on the bed, and the beds were all 6 feet long, which were absolutely hopeless for me. Because I had an extra 3 inches, and every time the boat rolled over, I'd bang my head and get a crick in my neck. So I thought, this is going to be a great winter. I thought it was just about my first day on Radio London in Big L. There were no beds ready on the boat, and I had to sleep on the settee. And the boat rocked in the storm, and I fell off the settee onto the steel deck. And I said, I want out of here. I've had enough of this already. And they said, the boat's not going to be, the tender won't be back for another 2 days, so you better get used to it. So Radio North Sea was a similar experience in as much as we nearly crashed and drowned on the way over because of his force 8 gale and that little Mevo 2, which wasn't meant for crossing the channel. And Rodney Collins, to complete the story, Rodney Collins was a music journalist in London, and I'd known him for a couple of years, and he said, come out to Radio North Sea. He said, I've met the owners, and this one's going to be different. They pay in cash, in Swiss francs. He said, you don't have to worry about the tax man. Well, that was the only thing I didn't have to worry about. It was the tax man. And Rodney Collins, I had a hold of Rodney. When the boat came across the channel, it was, for the first 8 hours, it was quite reasonable rough. And then as soon as we turned to go south to Radio North Sea, the wind started coming as a crosswind, and everybody started going, whoop. And we went up on deck to have a bit of fresh air, and it started to snow. And I said, Rodney, Christ, this is madness.
This is not what you told me.
And Rodney said, I don't care. He said, I've had enough. I said, Rodney, you've gone green. And he said, no. And he let go. And I thought, God, Rodney, what are you doing? You're going to slide overboard. So I grabbed hold of him by the scruff of the neck and the other hand holding the railing and dragged him across and threw him in a big coil of rope. And threw him in and said, no, lie there, Rodney, and don't move.
He's still there.
I said, I need a Heineken's.
What a good idea. Michael, how did you first become involved with RNI?
I'd met Roger Day sometime before the days of Radio North Sea, in fact, back in the days of Radio Caroline, and asked him if there was any possibility that I could join Radio Caroline. And things were fixed up for me to join Radio Caroline. The week after, it was towed in by Weissmuller's, which was rather a disappointment to me. There was then various attempts to try and get Radio Caroline back on the air. One of them was from a fort in the Thames Estuary, which Andy and I, in fact, spent, I think, about a month on, not John throwing eggs at each other. And we were sent a little tiny Radio Shack Tandy 4-channel mixer, which was supposed to be the basis of the studio, and we realised then that it was just never going to happen again.
We didn't have a transmitter.
No. Well, that was the last thing they thought of.
Who needs one of those?
And so when Radio North Sea came on the air, Roger got in touch with me and said, would I still be interested? I said, yes, I would. He said, well, it's not up to me, you have to speak to Larry Tremaine. So I saw Larry Tremaine, and a couple of days later, I went out to the boat. And I thought, that's how pirate radio was. Subsequently, I did get out to the Caroline boat when it came back on the air again, and realised that the Radio North Sea boat was the Hilton Hotel, really. I mean, despite the fact one may complain about the beds only being 6 foot long, but it really was the Hilton Hotel in terms of food, accommodation and facilities for the presenters. We really were looked after very well. The crew were exceptionally kind and nice to the DJs. There was no sort of hint of jealousy or anything. We got along very well with the foreign DJs as well that did the other services. And I think I saw Captain Tom Harteveld here somewhere, unless my memory is playing tricks on me, who was a very jolly captain, as I remember.
You say it was like a hotel. I remember I went out there in the very early days with Carl Mitchell and Alan West, and we climbed on the ship, and there was a guy waiting on the ship to take our bags.
I was going to say you had champagne for that.
No. He was a steward, and he took our bags down to the cabins and took our shirts and clothes and hung them in the wardrobe, and we thought, wow.
Like Caroline, they would have been retailed.
Anyway, that lasted about 3 days, and they got rid of the idea of a steward after that.
I've heard some of the stories about you on the boat, Andy, but I never knew you had a steward. You had your own...
Well, he wasn't my personal steward.
Oh, go on, say he was.
But the food was of excellent quality.
The food was superb, yeah.
And I remember
I
don't know if they'd done a deal with Hero fruit drinks, but there seemed to be unlimited quantities of those little bottles of the Hero fruit drinks.
Yeah. What about you, Rob? How did you first become involved?
Actually, now you mentioned that, Michael, the other drink we had plenty of was Chocomel, wasn't it?
Yes.
Chocomel coming out of our ears. I became involved with RNI via a totally different route, actually. Funnily enough, I knew one of the record pluggers in London who worked for a company called Beacon Records, and she mentioned that RNI Nordsea had an office down in Charles Street in London, and I popped down to see her, and I met Larry at the time, and said to Larry, oh, by the way, I'd love to come out and work. He said, well, send your tape in, and I did that, and he didn't come back to me, but I popped down a couple of times. And I just happened to be in the office in Charles Street at the time when the phone call came through to say that Mark Wesley had been taken ill on the ship. So Larry came to me and said, do you want to go out? You have to be out there by tomorrow. I said, no problem. Went out and relieved Mark. He went off very, very poorly, and went out for a few weeks in 1970, and obviously went back in 71. And that was how I made it through.
It was quite an extraordinary station in the beginning, because we were being paid quite a lot of money, and when I say quite a lot of money, it was a very generous salary for working 2 weeks on and 2 weeks off, and there was no advertising or any paid advertising. And Bollier and Meister, who owned the station, had their headquarters in a hotel called the Grand Hotel in Scheveningen, which was a 4 or 5 star hotel, and they used to spend thousands and thousands of guilders staying there, and whenever we came off the ship they'd pay for us to stay there, and we often wondered how the station could stay on the air with no income from advertising coming in, and at the same time they were paying us an awful lot of money, and we could more or less do whatever we wanted. I mean, there was no sort of set format or design or whatever, until one day we were introduced to this American program controller called Larry Tremaine, which was a bit of a shock to us, because
the heater with the geeter.
The geeter with the heater.
The geeter with the heater.
Yeah, and I seem to recall, Duncan, that you and he didn't hit it off very well.
I thought he was talking absolute crap. The geeter with the heater. I said, what are you doing? You're running a warship here. Or are you coming out to play records with people? Yeah, man. I said, "Oh dear me, that's."
I think
That's
basically he was an inspired listener from California
Wasn't he the big boss with the hot sauce?
because he'd heard that somebody say that at Roscoe or someone.
But it never stopped Andy playing Ray Conniff back-to-back with the Nice.
Well,
It was needed.
Can I finish my Rodney?
Sure, yeah.
The rest of the Rodney Collins story is after RNI. He did survive that trip. When the weather was much calmer, so he could go back again to Scheveningen. He then, years later, he got a job as a publicist for Radio 1. And I was having a drink with Johnny Beerling, who was then working as the head of Radio 1. And I told Johnny Beerling the story about me saving Rodney Collins. And he said,
Why?
"You're the bloody person that's responsible for him being here, are you?" I said, "I was only trying to be helpful." And that was the end of that conversation.
there was a period in 1970 when, for some reason, Bollier decided to move the ship to the English coast. He'd asked one or two of us what we thought of the idea, and so we were young and a little mad, and said, "Yeah, well, let's go for it." And there was a general election planned for 1970, and Ronan, who was very hostile to the British Prime Minister Harold Wilson, looked for any opportunity to see him out of power, and he persuaded Bollier and Meister that for the duration of the election campaign they should change the name to Radio Caroline and start using anti-government propaganda. And so there we were on the air, a little like the voice of the Conservative Party. And Ronan had a big operation from Hayes Mews in London, which was his office, and he had a huge bus covered with posters of Harold Wilson dressed as Chairman Mao, and they were touring around the south of England, interrupting meetings by Labour Party candidates. And that was the period when we had the song "Who Do You Think You're Kidding, Mr. Wilson," which were you there for the recording of that, Chris?
I think I luckily missed that.
Yeah. But that was based on the song from the comedy television series Dad's Army, and they recorded that in London, and I think most of the people singing it were Radio 1 disc jockeys, in fact. I know.
That I do remember.
Yeah, Tommy Vance was on there, and Roscoe and one or two others.
What year are you talking about?
1970.
The year of the election, when everything changed.
In fact, the song was recorded by the producers at Beacon Records, and it was, I think Tommy was on there because he was going out with the record plugger at the time. Everybody was involved, everybody knew about it, and it was one of those occasions that, at the time I think no one thought anything of it, but historically looking back, it's one of those occasions that made absolute history, and it was one of those recordings that you can listen to and think, "Oh, well, wow, whose idea was that?" And it's one of those things that changed the shape of the way things were going, because it caught people's imaginations, and it was a wonderful piece of recording.
It was a shame, really, that the radio station was used as a weapon. It was the only time I know of it ever was, any of them.
Yeah, that's true, and I know we were being jammed by the government, whichever frequency we're on. Do you remember that process of,
yes, we were
avoiding the jamming?
We'd be on one frequency, and a couple of days later the British government would start jamming the radio station, and then it would be decided that we'd have to change frequency. And it's not like to change the frequency of a radio transmitter is not like just retuning the dial at home, because all sorts of components have to be retuned and adjusted, and capacitors changed and coils changed and so on. And I remember on several occasions all the disc jockeys were brought together in the large studio on the Mebo by Bruno, who was an engineer, and Peter Chicago, and we'd all be given sums to do, and you have to add these up, and we'd all hand our bits of paper in, and those would be the calculations for the new capacitors and the new inductors and the things that had to be put in the transmitter for our new frequency. Then we'd go off the air for a little while, everything would be madly adjusted, and then we'd back on the air in a new frequency. And then a few hours later, somebody on a shortwave radio from the UK say, "They're jamming you again," because of course we're sitting there on this enormous 50,000 watt transmitter, we can't hear if anybody's jamming us or not, so we have to rely on information coming back from the mainland that we are being jammed. So then we're all back in the big studio again with our calculations again, doing it all over again. And
Not one disc jockey knew what minus or plus J was.
No.
Who were the... I think with every radio station you get some great characters, and Michael just mentioned Captain Harteveld, who's here somewhere. I don't know where Captain Harteveld is, but...
Standing there behind.
Ah, there he is. There, in the jumper at the back there, by the tree with his hand up.
Captain Harteveld!
Top.
Hey!
I think it should be down
Round
here.
of applause for Captain Top.
He was a crazy man. he was the craziest captain we ever had. We can tell some Harteveld stories later, but Duncan, who do you remember from...
I can't even remember being there most of the time. But John Myers says, well, you definitely were, because I've got recordings of the programs you made. And talking about the frequencies, I went through the whole list of frequencies one day. I've got a copy of that, but that's the only copy I've got of anything. I do remember being up on the mast one day, and they said, I want to take some pictures of the boat and the people down below on the boat, on the deck. And suddenly I realized that the FM transmitter was on. I was like, thank you very much, Peter Chicago and whoever your friends are. That could have been dangerous. We were supposed to be off the air. And he said,
The sign saying don't touch.
Well, it never happened again.
You broke it.
But there weren't any characters on there, well, apart from yourself, Andy.
And you.
And
Captain Harteveld.
My motto was, if you can't drink it, it can't stay.
You know, we used to have a meeting at lunchtime with each of the captains to discuss how things were on board the ship. You know, it'd say, oh, tell the disc jockeys not to put their cigarette ends in the lavatory, and we'd say, oh, tell the crew to put the records away if they've been listening, that sort of thing. But one of the captains, we had two captains, the other one was called Captain Onus, and he wasn't really interested in anything like that. It was just an excuse to have a drink. And we'd go to his office or his cabin at lunchtime to discuss what was happening on the ship, and leave about 2 hours later completely pissed on
Everything's sorted
Geneva.
out, though. Everything
was sorted out.
Don't remember.
Luckily, none of us could remember it. Lindsay, some memories from you.
Well, as I said, I'd wanted to go to Radio Caroline first of all, and ended up on Radio North Sea, and it never even occurred to me that I would get seasick. It's just one of those things that I hadn't thought about. And it soon became quite apparent that on a relatively small boat, compared with a cross-channel ferry, that they move around a lot. And I was terribly seasick for my first week or so. And I remember doing a breakfast programme with a waste paper basket between my legs and being sick all the time that every record was playing, and could only speak briefly between the records, and then I'd be sick again. And the only thing I can say is that after that first week or so of being violently seasick, I remember Chris and I went back on a cross-channel ferry during what they called a rough crossing, and to us it was child's play. But what it meant was that everywhere people were being sick, the restaurants were completely empty, we got enormous piles of food, free drinks in the bar, it was great.
So it paid off.
So it paid off in the end. Rob?
I think one of the memories, actually, mentioning Captain Harteveld, one of my memories was when I first went out to the ship. I started playing, as you may know, I was always playing Dutch music and loved anything that was different to the mainstream. And I picked up on a Dutch record, which, you know, I didn't know much Dutch then. But I remember playing it and saying some wonderful things about this song, and then Captain Harteveld mentioned to me, he said, do you know what it means? And I said, no. And he said, well, what? He explained what it meant, and it was actually very, very filthy. No. So there I was playing this song, and it was to everybody in Holland, it was really disgusting. And I soon learned Dutch as best as I could, because I didn't play anything like that again. But apparently it was in the charts at the time, and I think it was one of those records that everybody loved. So it was good fun. It was a song with one of the words started with an L, and it had another L at the end, and it was a 3-letter word.
Lul?
Something like that, yeah.
You mean Big Lil?
And at the time, being a very naive young Englishman, I didn't know what it meant, but I soon found out.
I remember part of that story when we were on Radio London. We played what we called the Radio London theme. It was known as Big Lil. the Dutch crew came in and said, "I'm not sure you should call it that." When we just explained why we shouldn't call it that, Kenny Everett insisted it be called that.
Wonderful.
I'm afraid my memories of Radio London cross over with the Radio North Sea ones, and I get a little bit confused as to who said what to whom and how often. But basically, there was the same, and the captains were good, and certainly Captain Buniga from the Radio London days was a perfect gentleman, and he knew the ropes. He also knew how to keep a good supply of Dutch Geneva.
He was.
Which I helped him drink as much as possible.
That was another thing from the Mebo when it first came out in 1970. They were extremely generous. They gave us a bottle of whiskey a day for the disc jockeys, and about 200 cigarettes a week, I think. And
Camel.
Camel.
No, well, I didn't smoke, but I don't remember the whiskey.
No, you drank it all. That's why. There are lots of nice people come to see you today, Duncan.
So they must have heard me on Radio North Sea occasionally.
Yeah.
I can't remember. I said that to one of the producers at Capital Radio in London when it started up, and he was from Ireland. He said, "Of course you worked on Radio North Sea. My mother used to listen to you all the time." I thought, that was the audience I was after.
I mean, we said there was no advertising, and where was the money coming from? We know that the Bollier and Meiston, I think, were both multimillionaires and ran some company that was involved in the defence industry or communications equipment for, guided missiles or something. Yeah. I don't think any of us really knew exactly what they did, and I think some of what they did, they didn't want other people to know about terribly much. But I do remember that we did have these hero fruit juices, an awful lot of them, which you think, well, nobody would have bought that many. The Camel cigarettes. And we were always advertising Transportos Eros Portuguese for some reason. Nobody ever knew the reason why. But,
UNICEF.
UNICEF, that was another one, yes.
All the transmitters had some frequencies that the 31 metre band hated. Ding!
The other one that used to trip the transmitter all the time was Cat Stevens, Lady Darbanville. That used to do wonders for the transmitters, always off the air when that was played. In fact, in the end, I think we worked out some system of ducking that one, dropping it down as soon as that bass line came in. There were some wonderful stories from the early RNI days and through into the mid-70s as well, just before the station closed down. The one thing I think that it always did as a station and has not been recognised is the huge impact on music it had during that era. Some of the wonderful Dutch groups and some of the other groups that made it through the exposure through Radio North Sea. Now, I know that the English record companies were very, very aware of the impact the station had at the time, but sadly didn't actually, go out on a limb and show, apart from obviously, the support with records and whatever, didn't go to other people and say how important the station was, which is sad, I think, in a way. But if you look at the charts at the time and then look at what we were playing and look at what those records that the BBC hadn't picked up at the time, you see how much influence we had as a station, and it was good to see. And we had a great audience, a great listenership.
Mm. It's quite amazing when you sit at events like this and you start thinking about all of those years ago. You're reminded.
What rubbish is coming out next?
Yeah, you're reminded of stories. I remember there was an awful lot of money about at the time, and Bollier had a nightclub in Zurich called the High Life Club, and he would pay for each of us to go to this nightclub in Zurich.
All expenses paid.
All expenses paid. Your
luxury hotel overnight.
Luxury hotel at the, I think, Sheraton at
the Borlaug, wasn't it? The Borlaug in Zurich.
Yeah. And I think you got about, I don't know how much he paid for doing it, but we went along and did about an hour. Nobody had even heard of us. and nobody had even heard of Radio North Sea. I mean, you couldn't pick it up in Switzerland unless you had a shortwave set. But that was quite extraordinary. I mean, you would come off to quite a large sum of money if you're working 2 weeks. Then suddenly you'd make even more money by going over to Zurich and play records in this in the High Life Club.
I think really the whole thing was a station of accident rather than design.
How much was a large sum of money?
Lots.
I'm just worried about that, where my share went.
We shared it out between us.
Can you tell something about these, to go back to these election days?
Yes.
How the atmosphere was on board?
Terrifying.
Through hair, wheels and lost.
Well, we had we knew what was going on because one of the disc jockeys, Stephen Ladd, was in London, and just before the election, Bollier had given me a little transmitter to smuggle over to England, and there was a guy in Frinton called Bill Scadden, who was ex-policeman, and he was our ship-to-shore contact, and he had this little transmitter hidden in a wardrobe behind some jackets and whatever. So we had all of the latest news from Ronan's headquarters, because Stephen would phone Bill Scadden, and then Bill Scadden would send the message out to the ship. So that must have freaked them out a bit, because we could be reporting on things that had happened just a few minutes earlier. And we said 10,000 people have just walked into, or just left Hyde Park or whatever, and we were almost giving a live commentary, bar sort of 10 minutes or however long it took to get the message. Chris?
Very dangerous times when you look back, never do anything like that again.
Yeah. Well, Ronan is... I know how Ronan persuaded Bollier and Meister to change the name to Radio Caroline, because anybody who's met Ronan will know that he can be very persuasive. And when he first came over to London in about 1962, he studied a form of acting called the Stanislavski Method, which people like Marlon Brando and James Dean had studied. It sort of encouraged you to be yourself when you were playing a part. And that gave Ronan the confidence to act out his fantasies almost. And I mean, he would tell Bollier and Meister, the British public are going to love you, Herr Meister and Herr Bollier. You're going to be high in their esteem if you change the name to Radio Caroline. The British people will love you, and when the Conservatives win, they'll switch off the jamming and Bollier and Meister, yeah.
Well, that's something.
Little did they know.
They did switch the jamming off, though, didn't they?
They did, yes, when we came back.
Yeah, well, that was probably the right thing to do.
I think the most fundamental point about the whole incident in 1970 was that the key issue was the fact that the 18-year-olds, for the first time in the United Kingdom, got the vote. And because the opinion poll companies hadn't actually taken that into consideration, their polls that were reflecting the mood of the nation weren't as accurate as they would have been today. And that lost vote actually swung in those constituencies that were marginal constituencies in the country. And the areas that Ronan was very, very perceptive and used sort of American techniques of polling and going out and canvassing people, etc. And he was the first person I knew that had talked about these marginal constituencies. And if you looked at the place where the bus and all the work was being done, it was in those marginal constituencies, and that made a huge impact on the result. And I think that was, apart from the fact that the ship was broadcasting these messages, had a great influence, a major influence on the outcome of the election, and obviously an influence on the outcome of RNI as well.
Were you there for the elections?
No, I wasn't. No, I'd gone by then. I was only there 3 months. 3 months.
It seemed like longer.
Yeah. I'm sorry.
Sorry,
I'm sorry I was so boring.
Anything about this case Manders?
Yeah.
Yes.
Chris was on board. I know.
I was on board. Yes.
I mean that was quite strange.
It was a bit scary.
It was very scary at the time.
I know we were a drama queens by keeping everybody sort of informed of what
Ring
was
the
going
Grand
on.
Hotel now.
Yeah, it was that way.
I don't know the story. I think Manders had come to some arrangement with Bollier and Meister to run a sort of Dutch service from the ship, but we didn't know any of that at the time. And
This is before Bassett, obviously.
yeah, and that had some disagreement, and he came along to try to take over the ship, and this tug came out one day
I
with
remember it. With the big hose pipe.
the big
just
hose
spraying the
pipe.
antenna.
Yeah.
We were a little worried because there was children on board. With the 100 kilowatt transmitters, something must have gone down the water and hit the boat.
Yeah.
But luckily they didn't. I know there was a captain on board at the time. I won't go into all the dramatic language that was used at the time. If he puts one finger on my boat, I'll chop them off. So we're behind you there.
Yeah. Yeah, and then Manders went away in the afternoon, I think, and I think the Dutch Navy came out.
protectors.
Was it the Limburg or something like that?
Huge
One big
great warship.
destroyer,
Yes.
yeah.
Von Ness.
Was it? Oh,
Yes.
whatever.
I know we all went to tea on Radio Veronica.
I know we all went on there afterwards and got very pissed.
Yeah.
Sorry?
Limburg was from the Mini-Migo fight in the Christmas time, 73.
That's another story. Save that till next year.
There was another Dutch
was a very
Navy
bad
vessel that
period.
came out after the
I remember
Tom van der Linden
boats came out
episode as well,
There
wasn't
was
it?
fishing boats and sailing boats. There must have been 100 ships to see that day.
You know, as Chris says, I remember we went over to Radio Veronica, who were very kind to us as well, and they showed
Yeah,
us
they
around.
bought us a drink.
Yes.
Yeah.
Showed us how a radio ship should look.
After all, I worked for Carnegie. Home blast.
Yeah, but the guys on board didn't know
Yeah,
anything
we
about
had
that.
a good relationship with Veronica. They were
yeah.
very nice. There were a couple of newsreaders. Dick Clace, I think, was one of them, and Freek Simon, I think, was the other. And they were very nice guys. And I think Kees Mannenveld was it, the technician, and yeah, they were always very welcome. And we used to drink all of their beer, and they would have to come back a day or two later to get some of ours. But
How long did you stay on board? How long did you work for RNI?
well, I worked until September when it closed down. Because you left about the time of the election because you didn't agree with it.
I only did April to June,
Yeah.
3 visits.
You remembered, though.
I remember the 3 visits, yes, and I remember either Bollier or Meister coming to me in London, in Charles Street, and saying they wanted to pay me in English pounds and then by cheque if he could. And I said,
That was not the
the
deal.
tax man is too close to cheques and too close to English pounds. That's not what I want. I want Swiss francs like you promised. And he said, I'm not sure we can do that. And I said, well, I don't want to pay income tax on this. It's a bit too close to comfort. And so we departed. We agreed to go our separate ways.
I think one of the really useful things you did, Duncan, at the time, you, without any doubt, was the only production voice that had ever been near the ship. And I think you'd done a whole tape, of 216, 217, 218. So we changed frequency.
frequency
went
we
with
could
the
ever
tape,
use.
found something that was suitable, that'll do it, off we go.
That's because I knew Dave Hawkins, the engineer, who was setting it up and tuning the transmitter.
Yeah.
Every day we changed, sometimes 5 times a day.
Actually, we were all very nervous when Duncan came out because he was a bit of a legend
Yeah.
from
A real announcer.
a real disc jockey when we were just sort of playing at it. But actually, I have to say, in all seriousness, Duncan taught us some really good, or gave us some very good tips how to conduct ourselves on the air. And I mean, you were very generous with your with your advice, and it was really well. And as Chris said, he's got such a great voice. We're all going, "Oh, Duncan, can you say this? Can you say that?" You know, and it's actually sounded like Radio Duncan Johnson at one time.
Quite right, too.
All we did is just interrupt Duncan to play old songs.
It's a bit like Veronica, Radio Veronica. When I made some stingers and jingles for Radio 1 when it first started, they were on Radio Veronica the next week. I thought, oh, they did the same, did they? Oh, well, they managed to spread it about. I'm glad they managed.
Power today, power yesterday, nothing changes.
I did have a few moments with some of the people, though. The thing I remember most, but I can't remember who it was on Radio North Sea, was played table tennis. He was extremely good at table tennis.
Oh, that was the cook.
Was it Cook
Yeah,
or Hannibal?
yeah. Could have been Hannibal, but I think the cook was quite a good table tennis player.
Somebody
There was
was.
a couple of them, yeah.
Yeah,
There was also a sailor who could bite fish head straight off.
King Kong.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Remember King Kong, Captain Harteveld? King Kong?
Yeah. Young.
The worst was he then passed it to you. Do you want some?
But that's how we made Larry Geeter the heater. We found him out because when they knew that he played table tennis, he said, "Oh, I can do that." And I said, "Oh, I'm sure you can. We'll find someone who can play it properly." And he beat whoever he was, whether it was Hannibal or the cook. He beat Larry Geeter in about 3 minutes. And he decided he would then call a program meeting.
Which was really good at.
Yeah. I have to say that there were times when we were very anti-Larry because he was very American in his style. And I used to do the mid-morning show between 9 and 12. And I was supposed to wake Larry in his cabin at 11 o'clock. So he had a chance to wake up, have a shower, and go on the air. But I always used to deliberately forget to wake Larry up, and walking up to the mess room as somebody was reading the 12 o'clock news, I'd knock on his door and 12 o'clock, Larry. And he would rush down to the studio, and it was like starting an old engine because he would start off by talking, "Hi, this is Larry Tremaine on radio." And as he woke up, he would hear, "The Geeter with the heater, the big boss with the hot sauce." But it would take him about 20 minutes, half an hour to warm up. And that always gave us a lot of pleasure. For me, anyway. But there were lots of, we used to have lots of fights because we had a good relationship with the Dutch crew, and we used to have potato fights and egg fights and Vla fights, you know, the...
See, I said there shouldn't be
yacht.
food on these radio ships.
Yeah.
I can't remember anything like that. It was always quite sensible.
We had
when I
very
was
good
there.
rules. Do you remember the rule of no swimming off the Mebo? And then we all said we all swim off the tender. That was allowed.
I don't know if anybody else any other questions from that period.
Who compiled the charts throughout 1970, and did you have any say in the hit mix you were allocated?
Yeah, we did with Rob. You mostly did that sort of thing.
Not in 1970. During 71 onwards, I compiled the charts, and I didn't choose the hit picks because the jocks would choose their hit picks. But what I would do is have a list of records that were suitable, I suppose, in a way, because there's a lot of stuff, obviously, that just wouldn't be played. And we'd sit down and have a meeting and discuss those records, and each jock would choose a hit pick. In the 70s, I think we more or less followed the main chart.
Yeah.
We certainly played all the chart music, but the one thing we did was play a lot of new stuff before it got picked up by Radio 1 and whatever, and we were just ahead of the game at that time.
Charts were ahead of ours, so we were more experimental.
Exactly.
So we nicked their songs and played them. They made it in the English charts later.
Yeah, we had a lot of Dutch material, which Holland, for some reason at the time, had a lot of American releases before the UK. And so we picked up a lot of American stuff before the British market.
I do remember, Rob, we had a big discussion on the ship. Duncan was certainly there about what we should call the programme, because North Sea had the Hot 50 or whatever it was, and Duncan said, "We're going to call it the Nifty 50." Yeah. Now, for those of you who don't know, a Nifty 50 in English slang is another word for...
I remember the letter coming from the listener from the army saying, "Are you sure you want to call it that?"
That was a better ad-libber than I thought.
But we all used to like saying the Nifty 50. That was stopped when Larry Tremaine came out.
Oh, really?
Because somebody told him about it, and he said, "You can't have that sort of thing going on."
He had no sense of humour at all.
Absolutely none. Wanker.
He tried to think that he was, I don't know if you ever heard of him, Wolfman Jack.
Yeah.
He used to do from Mexico. Yeah. Well, from California, but it was like the California equivalent of Radio Luxembourg, broadcasting into California. And he was a pretty sharp operator. And Larry Tremaine always considered himself better. But unfortunately, he was the only one that considered himself better than Wolfman Jack.
I think, like Emperor Roscoe in the UK, Larry and Roscoe never actually hit the American airwaves, ever. just invented themselves when they came to the UK. Why not?
Presidente. The Presidente. Roscoe.
That was original.
Sorry, you've got another...
It's a name from the early months. What was Ed Marino's role?
Oh.
Check writer with pastor, wasn't he?
I remember he came out to the ship. I'm not sure what his involvement was, because it was never quite clear to us, because you used to get all sorts of strange people coming out to the ship, and we'd all heard of him.
They were just the disc jockeys.
And he claimed to have an interview with some singer called Dorothy Squires or something like that. And
I'll have another large gin, please.
Yeah. and he brought a tape out, but I don't know what his involvement
Ed
was.
Marino, who I'd met on several occasions in earlier years, he was involved with recording programs at a restaurant called Villa dei Cesari in Thames, with Radio City, when Radio London was going to take over Radio City. And he was doing a recording of this program, interviewing the people in the band at the Villa dei Cesari when everybody showed up looking for Reg Calvert, who owned Radio City. And when we were all around there, we saw the national journalists come in, and they all disappeared quickly, and they're shouting, "Where's Reg Calvert?" Well, he was dead. He'd been shot. And Ed Marino was his right-hand man. He was going to produce the programs that none of us were convinced were any bloody good. Fortunately, he didn't have to use them. And so then when they suggested Ed Marino was going to get involved with RNI, I thought, God, there's another bullet coming for us.
Been here,
done that, thank you very much, I'm off. And they sent out a tiny little fishing boat to take us back. At least it was smooth sailing on the way back. We got out. I can see a projector there. You haven't got anything that plays a CD on it, have you? I don't know whose projector that is. Can
You'll get a copy, Duncan.
No,
I'm
I
sure.
wanted to play the CD. It was a couple of photographs that I took on Radio North Sea, and I thought they might be quite interesting.
Yeah.
But if it won't play on the machine, we can't see it, can we?
That's a computer.
Martin said he thought it might play on a DVD.
Yeah.
But all these technical people around here, I thought they might be able to make this work.
It's a bit like the old days, Duncan.
If it does more than on and off, it's got nothing to do with me.
Yeah. Actually, we've got two of the other guys from RNI. I think it's Joop du Pau, yeah? And Captain Harteveld. Hey.
Gosh. Come around.
Hey, Harteveld, how are you?
A little bit older.
These are the people that did all the hard work.
You know that, yeah.
Some of us are still alive, but nearly anyway.
A long time ago.
Yeah, the wife divorced me after that lot.
Well, I think we must say here and now, it was the best looked after ship. It was the safest. We felt safe in that ship. It was clean, tidy, well painted, well preserved. Would still be there today, probably, if these guys were doing it.
Sit down, Captain. Have a...
Yes.
Yeah.
He's still the captain.
Yes.
Yeah.
Big boss with a hot sauce.
So I don't know if anybody has any other questions they want to ask. You've got Captain Harteveld here now. He knows all of the stories.
Can I ask you a question, Anne? Could you tell the story of South
Your
American
life.
Getaway? What's the story behind it?
That was Mark Wesley did that, didn't he?
Yeah, it was. Mark was a very clever,
Yes.
producer. In fact, were you there when he did?
Yes.
Yeah. Tell the story, Michael.
Well, there's not a lot to say, but Mark spent hours and hours listening to various bits of music, editing jingles and so on, and he came across that bit of the music, which is from Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, and decided that he could sing along RNI to that phrase, edited loops of it, and that's how the South American Getaway became what was called on the little blue label on the cassette the Voom tune, we called it. And that was it.
I spent months trying to work out why it was called the Voon Tune.
I don't know why it was called the Voon Tune. That's what Mark called it. And that's really the story of it. It was just, there were lots of things he made, some of which never got on the air, but that was one thing that he did that everybody unanimously
he was a
liked.
very talented guy, wasn't he?
Yes.
Yeah. Anyway, we're going to leave you now because Rob Althoff is going to speak with Joop and Captain Harteveld. I suggest you stay because Captain Harteveld and Joop will have some wonderful stories, I'm sure. So
tell us about the anchor.
We'll see you all in the bar, I'm sure.
The Slookles.
Nothing about those things. Next time we're doing Slookles.